Hi, my name is Mark Zamueda, and this module is titled Arrays. Arrays are used to hold multiple objects or multiple values, and they're extremely popular in JavaScript. If you have a shopping cart application, you probably want more than one item in your shopping cart. In that case, you would use arrays. If you have an automobile application and your cars have more than one wheel, you might want to store the wheels in an array. So we'll learn all about how to use them in this module. We'll start off by looking at the JavaScript syntax to create and initialize the arrays. Next, we'll look at how we can access array items. The items in an array are referred to as elements. That's the technical term. We'll see how to manipulate arrays. There are many methods that we can call on arrays, and some of those specific methods are slice and splice. We'll go into those in detail. And we'll take a look at how we can search for items in an array and loop through the elements of an array. Finally, we'll take a quick look at working with arrays in the DOM. We want to be able to manipulate web pages based on data stored in an array. So let's get started and see the syntax to create and initialize arrays. Arrays are objects that can hold multiple values or objects. So we want to be able to create these arrays and initialize them with some kind of values to start with. To create an array, we simply use square brackets, as we see here. We're creating a new variable called values, and because of the square brackets, values will be an array, but it'll be empty. It has no values inside of it. So let's see how we can initialize it at the same time we create it. In this example, you can see that we have three values, 1, 2, and 3, inside the square brackets. So now we're creating and initializing the array to these three values. Each item inside an array is called an element. So you would say values has 3 elements. And this is the simplest, most common way of creating arrays, but you can also create it with some code. Let's see the next example. So here we're using the array object with the capital A, and we're calling a method on that called of. So we're creating an array of 3 values, 1, 2, and 3, and we're assigning it to the new variable values. I prefer to use the square brackets, but feel free to use this method call as well. Let's go to Visual Studio Code and see this in action. So I'll create an array, and we start off by declaring a variable. I'll create a constant called values. And using the square bracket notation we just saw, let's add the values A, B, and C. Notice here that we're using strings. You can have any data type inside of an array. In the slides, we saw numbers, and here we see strings, and you can even mix and match different data types. But it's a best practice to always use the same data type within an array. It makes things much simpler. So we're creating our array, and now let's log out values. I'll save it. And when we look in the console, we can see the array. This 3 in parentheses means that the array has 3 elements. And we see the square brackets showing the elements inside of the array. But this is just the shorthand notation. If you wanted to look into it more deeply, we can click on the triangle to open up this line. And here we can see that the first element, A, has an index of 0. So always remember that when we're talking about elements in an array, we start counting with 0. Element B is at index 1, and element C is at index 2, and the length is 3. Now an array is actually an object. Let's log out type of values. I'll save it, and we get object. So an array is not a built-in data type. If you wanted to find out if a variable was an array, there's a method we can use. The method is on the array object with a capital A, and the method is isArray. And I'll pass it values. I'll save it, and looking in the console, we get true. So values is an array. And that function might come in useful. Let's quickly take a look at MDN and see how we can find a lot more methods that are attached to the array object. I'm at the Mozilla Developers Network, and I searched for array. We can scroll down, and here we see the properties. By far the most common property is length, where we get the number of elements in the array. But then we have a wide range of methods. You see the method we just used right here, array.isArray. And we also use this one, Array.of. That's what let us create and initialize an array at the same time. But once we have a variable that holds an array, we can access all these methods. And we'll be taking a look at several of these throughout this course. But you may want to check out this documentation in detail because there's really a lot to arrays. They have a lot more features and methods than we can cover in this course. Again, it's at the Mozilla Developer Network and search for Array. In the next clip, we'll take a look at how we can access the elements of an array. Let's see how we can access array items. And again, array items are generally referred to as elements, but we might want to pull out an element to look at it, or we might want to change an element. Let's see the syntax for this. So we're creating an array called values, and it has 3 elements, the strings A, B, and C. Now to access the first element, A, we use square brackets on values and the index of 0. Always remember that arrays are 0-based when it comes to indexing. So values bracket 0 is equal to A, and values 1 would be B, and values 2 would be C. Now if we specify an index that's outside of the range of the array, we'll get undefined. So values 3 is undefined. Let's look at this in code. So like in the slide, let's access one of these elements. I'll say values, square brackets, and 0. I'll save it, and we get A in the console. That's at index 0. And C would not be index 3. You got to remember that we start counting at 0. So the C is actually at index 2. To verify that, we'll look at values 2, and it's C. And of course, if we go out of range and look at some index that we know we don't have, I'll save it, and we get undefined in the console. Another thing we could do is we can use this bracket notation on the array in order to change one of the elements. So go back to looking at value 0. We know that's A, but let's change it. Let's set values index 0. We'll set that equal to, say, AAA. I'll save it, and we get AAA. So we can easily change any value in the array using this bracket notation. In the next clip, we'll take a look at how we can very easily add elements to the beginning or end of the array, and also take elements off the beginning or end of the array. Last, this will take off the first element of the array, so let's just rename this variable. And we'll log out first as well. I'll save it. So after we call shift, the new array is set to B and C, and our variable first is set to A. So shift works on the beginning element of the array. Likewise, we have unshift. And we don't need to assign that to anything because that'll add a value onto the array. Let's unshift the string hello, and we'll just log out values. I'll save it. And our new array is set to hello ABC. And similar to push, we could add more arguments here. Let's say hello world. I'll save it. And both of those elements are now in the array, hello, world, and then ABC. So that covers working with the front and the end of the array, but sometimes we want to work with items in the middle of the array to insert or delete somewhere inside the array. We'll take a look at that in the next clip. There are 2 more methods that are extremely common when you're working with arrays: slice and splice. Slice creates a brand new array that's based upon some slice of an original array, and splice is used to insert or delete elements somewhere within the array, not just the beginning or end as we saw in the prior clip. Let's see some examples. So first we'll look at slice. We're setting values to a new array of A, B, and C. Then we execute values.slice, and we have 2 arguments. The first argument is where we want to start to take our slice, which is element 1. And remember, element 1 is B. It's not A. A is element 0. And then 2 gives us the ending element that we want to look at, which is 2, in which case that would be C. So this line actually creates a new array. And that new array is stored in the variable new values. When we log out new values, we get our slice, which is only item B. The item at index 2, the end position, is not included in the results. And it's important to remember that even though we took a slice, it left the original array the same. It essentially made a copy of that slice of the array without altering the original. Next, we'll look at splice. And we'll specifically look at splice for deleting. So we have our values array set up to A, B, and C. And we execute values.splice with two arguments. The first argument is the index of the element we want to delete. And the second argument is the number of items we want to delete. So index 1 is the B. And let's just delete that B by specifying one item. When we log out values, we get A and C. The B is gone. And splice can also be used for inserting. So we're working with the same array here, values, but we're executing values.splice. 1 refers to the index where we want to start inserting or deleting, which would be the B or right before the B, between the A and the B. That would be the new index 1 if we inserted something. And then 0 specifies the number of items we want to delete. In this case, it's 0. We don't want to delete anything here. We just want to insert the next argument, which is foo. When we log out values, we get A, foo, B, and C. So again, the three arguments to splice, the first one is a 1, and that's our starting index location. The second one is the amount of items we wanted to delete. Here we don't want to delete anything. And then the third and on up arguments are all values that get inserted into the array. So let's take a look at slice and splice in Visual Studio Code. So we have values set up as an array of A, B, C, D, and E. Let's take a slice of the middle three letters. I'll execute values.slice, and we want to start at index 1, that'll be the B. And the second argument is the index of the end of our array, where we want to take the slice. But notice this note here in the help in Visual Studio Code. This is exclusive of the element at the index end. So if we wanted to grab B, C, and D, we would have to pass the index of E, and E will be excluded. That index is 4. And this will return a new array, so let's create a new variable. I'll call it new values. And we'll log out new values. I'll save it. And we get B, C, and D. Another thing that we can do with slice is not pass it any arguments. I'll take those out, and because we're not passing anything, it'll make a copy of the array. I'll save it, and we get the array A, B, C, D, and E. And just to prove that the original array does not get altered, let's take a slice out of this one, out of values, and then instead of logging new values, let's log out the original array. I'll save it. And you can see that the original array did not change. We still have all 5 elements. Now let's take a look at splice. These have very similar names, but we just add a P after the S. Splice. So the first argument is the starting index. Let's say we want to delete the letter C out of this array. That's index 2. So we'll specify a 2. And then the second argument, as we can see here in the help, is the delete count. How many items do we want to delete? Let's just delete 1. We'll delete the C. And this will alter the original array. So I won't look at the return value. I'll just alter values and then log values out. I'll save it. And now we can see that the C is missing. We deleted it. If we change the second argument to 2, we'll delete 2 elements. So now we deleted C and D, but we still have E. Now remember, splice can delete, but it can also insert. We still use this delete count argument. Let's just set it to 0. So now index 2 refers to C, but we're not going to delete it. We're just going to insert a new value. Let's just insert hello. I'll save it. And our new array is A, B, hello, C, D, E. So we inserted hello. Now if we wanted to delete that C value, we can specify a delete count of 1. So we're starting at the second index, and we're going to delete 1 element and then add hello. I'll save it. And we get A, B, hello, D, and E. Notice that C has been deleted. So that's all we're going to cover for modifying arrays. You can learn a lot more at the MDN webpage if you search for array. In the next clip, we'll take a look at searching and looping through arrays. Many times we'll want to search through an array and find the index of some element. And sometimes this involves looping. Some of the array methods will loop for you, but then sometimes you want to get control over looping. You might want to perform some action on each element in an array, or maybe you have a complex search, like you might need to dig into an object and do some kind of calculation to see if an element matches what you're looking for. So let's look at some of the methods that can accomplish these things. IndexOf is a method that lets us get the index of a certain value in an array. We're setting up a values array, and we're executing values.indexOf, passing it the string C. And that'll return an index of 2, because that's where C's at. But what if we search for something that doesn't exist in the array? Here we're searching for values.indexOf D, which doesn't exist. We'll get a -1. Remember, we don't get undefined. -1 shows us that we did the search and nothing came up. There's a filter method that's another way of searching through an array and creating a new array on values that fit some kind of criteria you're looking for. This is a little bit more complex. We'll see why. So we start off with our values, and we want to execute values.filter. We want to go through this entire array, item by item, and create a new array based upon whether or not the item matches some criteria. So for this filter method, we actually pass it a function. And the function has a parameter item, which will be set one by one to each element of the array. So the first time this function is called, item will be A. And then the second time it'll be called, the item will be B, and so on. And the function returns either true or false. We're checking if item is greater than B, alphabetically. So filter will create a new array, and if we return true, the element stored in item will be added to the array. So when we log out set, which is our new variable, we only get C, because the only item that's greater than B is C. So the real powerful and interesting thing here is that we're passing a function to a method. And for each element in the array, the function will get called, having item set to that element. There's another similar method called find. That'll look through each element of the array and find the first item that matches some criteria. So for this example, we have values, an array set to A, and then a triple B, and then a C. Those are the 3 elements. Then we execute values.find. And again, the argument to find is a function. So for each element in values, this function will be called once. The first time it's called, item will be A. The second time it's called, the item will be the triple B. Then the third time it's called, the item will be C. And we're trying to find an item that matches some criteria. So we want to return true or false. If the item.length is greater than 1, we'll return true. And then that value will be stored in the found variable. When we log out found, the only item whose length is greater than 1 is the BBB item. So that's what we get. And again, when you're working in JavaScript, it's very common to be passing functions around like this. There are a lot of methods that take functions as arguments. So this function will be called until it returns true, in which case we found our item. And there's one other similar method that we can take a look at on arrays, forEach. ForEach lets us execute a function on each element of an array. So we have our values array set up, and then we execute values.forEach, again passing it a function. So for each element in the array, this function is called once. The first time, item will be set to A, second time it'll be set to B, and so on. And we're simply logging out each item. So it'll log out A, B, and C. Let's take a look at these in Visual Studio Code. So looking at the indexOf method, we're executing values.indexOf A. I'll save this, and we get 0. That's at index 0. And if we look at indexOf C, we get 2. If we search for something that doesn't exist in the array, I'll say V, I'll save it, and we get -1. And that's important because undefined could be a value inside the array. But a -1 tells us that there's an index of -1, which is impossible, so it was not found. And I'll paste in the code from the slide for filter. So we have our values array, and we want to execute values.filter. So this function will execute one time for each array element. And to prove that it does that, we can just log out item. If the item is greater than B, that'll return true. And that item will become part of the new array that filter creates, and that'll get stored in set. Let's save this, So we can see that our function that we're sending the filter did get called 3 times for each element in the values array. And the new array that created has the value C. Let's add some more values just to make sure that our filter is working properly. I'll add D and Z. I'll save it. And we can see that the new array that gets created has the values C, D, and Z, because all of those match the criteria of the item being greater than B. It's doing an alphabetical check. And I'll paste in the code from the next slide. That's the find function. I'll make some space. So we have our values array. Then we're calling values.find. And we want to find an item that has a length that's greater than 1. As soon as we find that, it'll be stored in the found variable, and we'll log that out. I'll save this. And we find the value BBB, because that's the only item that has a length greater than 1. What if we change C to a bunch of C's? I'll save it. And we still get back just BBB, because as soon as we find an item that matches the criteria, we're done. It never gets to the third element. And finally, let's look at the forEach method call. I'll paste in that code. So we have our values array, and we execute values.forEach. And again, this function gets called for each element in the array. We'll simply log out each item. I'll save it. And we get the values A, B, and C. So there are different ways to execute this. We can use this forEach method, or we could use a for or a while loop, as we learned earlier in the course. But this forEach method is a newer addition, and it's preferred when you're guaranteed that each item in the array needs to be passed to the function. So that's all we're going to cover as far as methods go. If we quickly look at some of the methods we didn't cover here on the Mozilla Developer Network, we can see there really are a lot of features to arrays. We covered things such as indexOf, forEach, find, but you should really check through all of these methods just to know what arrays are capable of. In the next clip, we'll take a look at modifying a web page based upon an array. When we're working with the DOM, it's very common to use arrays and array-like objects. Let's take a look at a common use of arrays. So here's our code from the last clip, and I'll just erase all of this. And before we start writing code, let's look at the HTML file, index.html. Our web page is actually made up of containers, and these are bootstrap containers. You can see here that this div has a class of container, and as we scroll down, we see another class of container and another class of container. So we have all these containers that make up the web page. So let's try to grab all those and store them in an array. So we can access the document object, and before we saw that we could use the function getElementById right here. That's a method call that'll retrieve only one element based upon its ID attribute. But we want to call this one getElementsByClassName. And this will return all of the elements that have a certain class name that we pass. And we wanted to look for the containers, which have a class of container. Now, strictly speaking, this returns something that's not officially an array, but it acts very much like one. We can use the square brackets to index the various containers, and it has the .length property to get the length of the array. But let's just go ahead and assign these containers that we get back to a variable. We'll call the variable containers. And I'll just put this on the next line to make sure we can see the whole thing. Let's log out containers and see what we have. I'll save it and I'll open up the console. And we get something called an HTML collection, but that's very similar to an array. The 8 means it has 8 elements. There are 8 containers. I'll open this up and you can see the elements here. Here's our original container. And it looks like there's something else here for index 1. And this CRF cigar banner, CRF stands for Carved Rock Fitness, the demo site we're working with. And let me click on that and we can see the banner highlighted right here. It's these pictures of the boots and the text below it. So let's take this CRF cigar banner and we'll find out what index it is in the array. And let's try to hide it. I'll go back to the console. We can see that the CRF cigar banner has an index of 2. So containers is essentially an array, even though it's telling us it's an HTML collection. We can say containers, element 2, Let's access the classes, ClassList.add, and we can use the same Bootstrap class we saw earlier, d-none, which stands for display none. We want to hide it. So containers is an array. We're going to access element 2, which is this cigar banner, the picture of the boots and the text under it. And we're going to add the class d-none, which will set the display attribute to none. I'll save this. And let's take a look at the website and make sure that image is gone. And it is. Before it was right under Get a Grip, and now it's completely off the page. If we wanted to hide the next container after that, I think it's this trail review one. I'll save it. So we're hiding containers index 3, and the boots are there, and the trail review is still there. So actually, let's just take a look at our console. And what we hid was this CRF story item. And that was all the pictures that came after this trail review. So those are missing now. And for the fun of it, let's just remove container 0, see what that is. I'll save it. And that was our heading. We no longer have our logo and menu on the top. But the point is that we're accessing all of these elements because they're stored in this containers array. That's all we're going to be covering on arrays. So let's wrap up this module with the summary. We began this module by looking at how we can create and initialize arrays. We create an array variable, and we use square brackets to specify the elements of an array. We assign that to the variable. Another way we can create and initialize an array is with the Array.of method. Each argument becomes an element in the array. Next, we looked at accessing the array items, or the array elements, and we use square brackets for that. We specify the array, square brackets, and the index of the item we want. Remember that the indexes are 0-based. The first element is index 0. Next, we looked at manipulating arrays using various methods. We looked at push and pop. Push adds elements to the end of the array, and pop takes the last element off the array. We looked at shift and unshift, which work at the beginning of the array. Shift will take off the first element of the array, and unshift will add elements to the beginning of the array. Next, we looked at slice and splice, two very popular methods on arrays. Slice is used to create a new array from an existing array. It makes a copy of a slice within the array. And splice has two purposes. It can delete elements. You specify the index and the number of elements you'd like to delete. You can also use the same method to insert items. You specify the index where you'd like to insert, and if you don't want to delete anything, you just set delete count to 0. But if you wanted to delete something, you specify a number of the number of items you'd like to delete. And then at the end, you add one or more new items that you'd like to insert into the middle of the array at the index. And we looked at array searching and looping. We saw how to use indexOf and find to find elements within the array. We saw how to use the filter method, which creates a brand new array of items that are filtered from an original array. And we saw how to use the forEach method. This will call a function on every element in the array. Finally, we took a look at arrays in the DOM. We called document.getElements by class name, and we got an array of all the elements that had a certain class in our web page. We could use this to manipulate the DOM. So that's all we have for arrays. Be sure to visit the Mozilla Developer Network and search for Array to learn more about Array's many methods.